Thank you very much, President, Excellencies, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and dear UNDP team. I'm pleased to be addressing you this morning for the first time on my first annual session of the Executive Board, and it coincides with almost a year of being in post as administrator, so it is also for me a very opportune moment to reflect on what has been accomplished by UNDP over the past year and how we are moving forward in a focused and future-focused manner. But before I begin my report to you, let me for a moment express our sympathies and condolences to Guatemala, where the El Fuego volcano has caused such havoc. And as so often when we wake up in the morning and receive our daily briefings in the Secretariat, yet another natural disaster strikes, and our sympathies are very much with the people of Guatemala and also UNDP, together with OCHA and our colleagues in the country team, are already supporting national rescue and relief efforts. We meet today at a point in time that is not just defined by a regular business cycle in the work of an agency. We are meeting in the midst of a moment in time that is defined by significant change, disruption, uncertainties, questions that are being posed, and also the search for new directions, both within the United Nations and in the world at large. And it is against that backdrop that I would like to try and present to you both where UNDP's work over the past year fits into this picture, and how what you have licensed us with a strategic plan to move the organization towards begins to respond to the profile of demand and need and purpose of the UN's development program in the years that lie ahead. I will try and not refer to too many numbers and statistics, but I would like to just draw your attention to this wonderfully colorful annual report that you have found on your seats. Now, some of you may be sitting there and looking for a deeper interpretation of this very colorful cover. I leave it to your speculation. My only request to the team was produce a cover that will make sure that wherever this report lies on your desk, you will always recognize this to be UNDP's annual report. Beyond that, I'm told that this configuration of circles signals momentum, and that is very much the theme of my presentation to you today. UNDP is an organization on the move, and I will return to that theme in a number of instances. Let me briefly, and not take too much of your time because you are very familiar with that global setting within which we operate, but I think it is important to remind ourselves that when I refer to profound changes and disruptions, these really are not, in a routine sense, things that we always confront. And I will just cite 4 or 5 examples in a moment. But what is intriguing is that in each one of these, the fundamental questions about what kind of development choices, what kind of development paradigm, and what kind of development pathways nations and societies will choose has moved back to the center stage. There are always periods in history when somehow things seem to be clear. There is a consensus, and therefore the question about what next is not the immediate one, but rather of how do we just move forward. The pathways ahead are not clear, neither for individual countries, very often not for individual citizens, and certainly at this point in time, increasingly also not clear for the global community. In this very building here, we are in many ways a fulcrum, a crossroads, perhaps a lens through which the world can refocus and rediscover that which unites it while acknowledging the things that divide it. But development, in its true sense of the word, and therefore also in the mandate encapsulated in the work of the United Nations Development Program, clearly has a central role to play in this, principally by empowering nations, communities, to arrive at informed choices, sometimes against a significant degree of uncertainty. This is our daily task in an abstract sense, and I will, in the course of my report, refer to many of the specific instances. But let me briefly, in my speech that will also be uploaded later on, point to 5 examples of where the context within which development moves center stage as a way of trying to respond to these changes and challenges becomes very obvious. The first one is, in whichever way you want to refer to it, the fourth industrial revolution, the digital age, the age of automation, or the transformation of artificial intelligence, the new markets, the new business models that are emerging for services in our economy. We live in an age that is almost unimaginable when companies that didn't exist 10 years ago, 10 years later, become largest stock market registered entities in the world. When an entity that doesn't own a single hotel room becomes the world's largest service provider in terms of finding accommodation. And you know these examples. This is not normal. This is disruptive. It is fundamentally shifting the way our global economy will work, and by consequence and implication, it fundamentally changes the options for others who play in this global economy. And I was very struck in the response to the Belgian permanent representative's question about sustainability, how one of our participants in the project responded that, my market today is accessed through Instagram. And imagine 10 years ago, you could not have provided that answer to your question. Today, we provide a catalytic input and a person finds their way into the global marketplace. It is changing the nature of development in a national sense. It's changing the nature of development in terms of scope, and certainly changes the nature of our work. We have to adapt to this, and as Teg and I were just talking, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, and yet there are literally hundreds of millions of people who are still working in the first industrial revolution setting. So here lies one fundamental responsibility both for UNDP and others, but certainly the UN, to try and understand the consequences of this increasing spectrum of reality and how we ensure that in the ever-increasing speed and pace of change, significant parts of the world population are not left behind. This is a core challenge for development. A second example, the ever-growing inequality, which is defining not only economic data and the metrics of measuring people's livelihoods, it is actually defining the political discourse. In societies that, in a strange sort of way, the SDGs began to capture through their principle of universality. Inequality is today not the challenge of a developing nation or a least developed country or a middle-income country. It is a challenge in virtually every country across the world. And let's be frank, we have not found adequate answers to this, and the erosion of the social contract between communities, between the state and its citizens, but also between government that provides the license for business to operate and the capital markets and the public. All of these are being challenged and pose fundamental questions about the role of government, of governance, and also of a new pathway towards aligning that extraordinary, for instance, availability of capital in the $300 trillion range in our financial markets with a world that is trying to pass through significant transitions, but not at the expense of falling apart as societies. Inequality is fundamental to the long-term success, not only of development, but of our societies. And therefore, I'm also very pleased to refer today to a new partnership that we will announce in a few days' time officially with the World Inequality Lab, led by somebody that many of you may be familiar with, Thomas Piketty, and a team of experts, scientists, academics that have now taken the original work that made him such a reference in this issue of inequality to a global level, trying to understand what is happening with inequality and how countries, economies, societies can respond to that. Because in UNDP's work, this is increasingly one of the fundamental questions being asked of us in the context of our SDG advisory work. And very closely linked to that, the phenomenon of poverty. We continue to confront an enormous task. And sometimes those who still remain poor in today's world that is richer than ever before, in financial terms at least, historically speaking, will be perhaps the most challenging to lift out of poverty. Therefore, that initial rhetorical link between the MDGs and the unfulfilled and unmet targets of the MDGs continuing to be a focus of the SDGs, particularly around poverty eradication, are central to defining UNDP's work in today's world. So from the governance of these transitions to the focus on poverty eradication and addressing issues of inequality, we find ourselves with the development advisory services that we can provide at the center of some of the most challenging issues in the development arena globally and nationally. Helping countries to manage all of this against the backdrop of new challenges. Here, climate change being perhaps the most fundamental challenge to any economy on the planet today. Whether we will do it in synchronization, collectively and all at once, or in some form of slightly more dissipated effort, I think there is little doubt that decarbonization of our global economy is the trajectory against which investments, strategic infrastructure decisions, and also the kinds of energy systems, transport systems, and urban development parameters of the future will be defined. There is an enormous need not only for a technical, technological, and policy, and therefore governance input in a development sense, there is also an extraordinary need for mobilizing finance. Our role as UNDP, alongside the IFIs, but particularly also national governments that are looking at their domestic markets and how to mature them in order to align and attract more private sector finance and capital in support of SDG strategic goals and objectives, is clearly a centerpiece of this. And without resolving this financial challenge, both in terms of international Paris Agreement-linked financing, such as the Green Climate Fund, but also the ability of nations to mobilize their own industry, their own financial markets, to invest in these transitions will be critical. And UNDP already is working in this context in over 140 countries with a portfolio of over 800 projects with roughly $3 billion of direct finance and another $10 billion of leveraged finance, perhaps making it one of the principal partners to countries in addressing these challenges. Finally, the challenge of conflict, of fragility, of displacement. It is not just a statistic. We are, in fact, living at a moment in time where conflict has become much more prevalent, also persistent, and tragically costly in terms of lives and finance. Our engagement as UNDP today already is very significant in this field. 40% of our financing last year was focused on supporting countries in conflict and fragile contexts. So to those of you who are concerned whether UNDP is really deploying and applying itself in assisting countries who find themselves at the most critical moment in need, please rest assured, close to half of our work is focused on assisting countries in either conflict or post-conflict or crisis situations. But it must go deeper. Our work, as part of also the reform agenda of the Secretary General, looking more at the linkages, looking more at how development and humanitarian interactions can produce greater returns on investment, greater benefits, beginning from a refugee population and a host community to the kind of work that both Mark Lowcock and I are trying to, in a sense, promote through leadership by example when we travel together to the field to encourage our teams to look at how we can do business differently in the way that you have called one, a new way of working. But also in the recently released Pathways to Peace report that the UN published together with the World Bank, we outlined a number of significant step changes that are needed. The chronology of intervention and deployment of international support in crisis situations is simply an anachronism. And there is a wonderful diagram in this report, if you ever have a moment to look at it, in which a kind of triple and quadruple helix demonstrates that actually development, humanitarian crisis interventions are not a matter of chronology. They are a matter of deployment at different stages in different intensity, but designed as a package that can be mutually reinforcing rather than missed opportunities. And therefore, I want to emphasize that both with OCHA and UNDP, you can count on us over the coming years, including through the steering committee that the Secretary General has set up, that we will continue to search for a far more proactive way of addressing this in the field and practically. Just as our recent signature of a new agreement between UNHCR and UNDP illustrates the serious intent and commitment on the part of both institutions to work far more closely together on addressing both the issues of displacement, refugees in the context of our respective mandates. These are just illustrations that form part of an effort to relink. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, so in that context of what is happening and changing around us and the centrality of development in helping countries not to be overrun by these developments, to be proactive in shaping informed choices and opportunities, Agenda 2030 and the SDGs have taken center stage. There are no panacea. I think we all know this. And we also know that the challenge of operationalizing the SDGs is by no means an easy one. But I think nobody ever really assumed that it would be easy. The whole point of the SDGs is that it is a paradigm shift in the way that we frame development issues, development responses, and solutions. And I'm grateful to you, the Executive Board, for having authorized and called on UNDP to make Agenda 2030 or the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs the foundation, the framework within which UNDP's work will have to prove itself and evolve over the coming years towards 2030. I can assure you that we are fully focused on that mandate and that direction. And many of you have called on us to be more focused in what we do. I can assure you the SDGs are a remarkable tool for focusing our efforts, but they are also a smarter tool than simply to ask us to pick a few sectors or a few countries and call that focus. I continue to, in a sense, engage with many of you in the hope to persuade you that the United Nations Development Programme is not an institution that is in a boutique business of providing services. It is the foundational institution upon which a UN development system has evolved its offer of today, and it remains the only institution within the UN family that is predicated on supporting countries in their efforts to develop their own national choices about development, building on a principled approach of the United Nations and drawing on the extraordinary opportunity that we can provide as an organization that has its finger on the pulse of development in 170 countries to tap best practice and make the journey of development, discovery, and research so much more effective and hopefully focused in our support to countries. In the way that we have proceeded to interpret that, you are now following our work. The signature solutions that we put forward that define, in a sense, key areas of work that both reflect established demand from US countries and many years of established competence in the organization will continue to guide us in the way that we support countries. But we do so with the SDG framework in mind. And therefore, the solutions and the approaches that we are now developing with countries are also defined by something that I know sometimes sounds a little bit abstract, but a deep commitment to innovation. UNDP's capacity to be a catalyst, to be a partner to, and to be also a co-creator of innovative solutions is something that is not just rhetorical. Over 90% of our staff are deployed in country on the front lines of development with our partners, every day trying to address problems and finding solutions. Our business, if I may use that term for a moment, is innovation. The question is, can we make the institution as a whole support that front line of development in the sense that international partners are critical partners to national governments and organizations in bringing those kinds of solutions about. I think you will see over the course of the next few months already the first fruits of the kinds of initiatives that we have tried to either reconfigure, to establish newly, or to reinforce within the organization, building on a significant amount of experience. But as we move forward, let me emphasize again, against the backdrop of a strong focus on governance, which remains a core offering of UNDP, helping governments to provide the right kind of governance frameworks, be it in terms of a technological frontier in engaging citizens through e-government, be it in terms of the fundamental human rights mechanisms that are available to citizens in a country, be it through the parliaments that we support, and UNDP remains the single largest partner to national parliaments in terms of capacity building on parliamentary procedures, on how to conduct public inquiries, how to engage with citizens. Our work in terms of democratic elections, where we continue on average every 2 weeks to support an election around the world. And I was very pleased to see in Zimbabwe the very practical implications of helping a country in just 6 months to use a new biometric registration system to register over 5.5 million voters, therefore making an election, for the first time in the history of Zimbabwe, far less volatile and vulnerable in terms of the voters registered. These are the kinds of examples that I think will continue to define both our specific support, but embedded against a broader Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 approach to development. Before looking forward in terms of the implications of that, let me just briefly also thank both you as member states, our partners and our staff, for having allowed the organization in the midst of significant transitions, including a new leadership in terms of a change in administrator, UNDS reform and many other developments, to have made 2017 an impressive year of delivery. With all the data now in, I can report to you that in 2017, the United Nations Development Programme delivered a portfolio of $4.5 billion in expenditure, a $500 million jump from the year before. I want you to just register this for a moment, because it is a tribute, an enormous tribute to our partners and our staff, because in all of the changes that were happening, the organization not only delivered, it actually accelerated its delivery. And I'd like to think that it has something to do with the new administrator. I'm sure most of the staff would say, despite having a new administrator, we actually managed to up our game. And therefore, these $500 million increase in turnover happened against the backdrop of a staff freeze, of not employing more people, of reducing the cost of doing business in UNDP in terms of the actual overheads that we charge. And all of this to say, please look at some of the fundamental KPIs and perhaps slightly revise your judgment that is often, I think, informed by a sense of what it might be rather than what it is. It certainly is my experience over the last year of learning and discovering the true nature of the portfolio of UNDP. It is also the highest delivery on record in UNDP's history. We ended the year at the same time without a deficit in our institutional budget for the first time in 6 years. And to those of you who know what it means to draw down your reserves, you will realize how important this is. Savings were realized through particularly the executive leadership of our Assistant Secretary Generals and the Bureau Directors of over $50 million in order to allow the institution not only to not bleed its resources, but actually to begin to invest in its capacity to deliver. We received an unqualified audit for the 12th year in a row. We retained our top ranking in the Aid Transparency Index as of the 2016 ratings, and we saw the independent aid data survey of 125 low and middle income countries rank UNDP first among development partners in 2017 in value for money terms, punching above our financial weight in terms of attracting users to our data and analysis. So, as a board, I think you should feel at least reassured that that which you have called for already with my predecessor Helen Clark, and that you made very clear in my first few weeks of my tenure, that this journey towards a more effective, a more focused, and also a more efficient organization is not slowing down, it is being accelerated. Nevertheless, and you will not be surprised, I have to bring back to you the figure that keeps me up and many of my colleagues up awake at night. It is that long-term erosion of the core funding of the organization. I feel deeply uncomfortable in sitting with you as an executive board and conducting an accountability dialogue that allows you to govern this organization and hold us accountable when the ratio of core to non-core funding is now 13 to 87% non-core. This is a very weak basis upon which to hold an institution accountable for its mandate. We can report to every single one of our dozens of donors on our thousands of projects on what we have done. And actually our record is surprisingly good. But you often ask, what is the role of the UN's development program? What is the mandate we have given you? How are you performing against it? How will we have that discussion in the years to come when 87% of our portfolio is the equivalent of walking into a supermarket and picking something off the shelf, paying for it at the till and leaving the shop again? It is not a long-term viable strategy for achieving what you have called for and the Secretary General has put at the top of his agenda of the UN Development System reform, that we must take the financing of the work of this organization as a whole, but also of this program, more seriously as part of the discussion about the future. Let me, however, also acknowledge that there are many amongst you who have made efforts to help us move beyond that somewhat scary and worrying figure. By, for instance, signing multi-year framework agreements or multi-year core agreements. Amongst them, I want to acknowledge Canada, Denmark, Belgium, Australia, and New Zealand, and I understand that Sweden will be hopefully joining within a week or two. And I also look forward to countries who have already led on this front and will hopefully be renewing their multi-year agreements, amongst them Turkey, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. In looking back over this year, therefore, I think you can take at least some cognizance and reassurance from the fact that this institution continues to deliver against a backdrop of significant changes and challenges. And here I also want to put the spotlight for a moment on many countries who don't normally appear in our list of countries as donors or contributors. They are the multitude of developing nations, middle-income countries, as we often refer to them, that provide GLOC, the government contribution to the costs of us operating in those countries. And let me point to another interesting phenomenon. For many of these countries, their contribution in relation to their GDP is often higher than the contribution of OECD member states in terms of their contribution to UNDP. So I want to particularly acknowledge the countries who have both the confidence and the willingness to invest in their partnership with UNDP, because without them, our presence model would not be viable any longer. And therefore, to those of you in the donor community who often ask the question, is our money really going to where we want it to go? Please do study the figures a little bit more closely, because what you will realize is that you have an extraordinary partnership at work here. A partnership where already 1/5 of the total turnover of this organization comes actually from non-OECD countries. I'm not sure there is any other institution in the development arena in the world that can point to this kind of partnership and, in a sense, an expression of confidence in its value to countries individually and to the idea collectively. But let me now look forward, and in trying to build on the experience of the past few years, I want to share with you very briefly a number of significant initiatives that my team and I have now put in place, empowered by your decision to adopt the strategic plan, foreshadowing also the Secretary General's UN Development Reform Agenda, and above all, understanding the evolving profile of demand that is emanating from the countries that we serve. UNDP is, in 2018, an organization on the move. It is an organization on the move that sometimes feels stressed because so many things have to happen at the same time. But it is one that is focused and is future-focused, as I try to emphasize in the discussion with you as board members last November. We have already initiated a review of our business model and processes. This is fundamental to both the compact with you as board members, where we said we will, as UNDP, continue to operate in the different development settings. But we must do so with also differentiated business models in order to be able to retain the viability and the mandate of this institution. So the UNDS reform, the delinking of the resident coordinators, has added an additional dimension to challenge that viability model as we operate. But equally important is we are deep diving and reviewing our business processes. This is an organization that is decades old. It has accumulated both layers and layers of administrative procedures and guidelines, often ad hoc and additive. We have seen some extraordinary progress, for instance, in the review of our project and program guidelines manual. I still hesitate to share this figure with you, but my colleagues are so certain that I want to share it with you. We have essentially reviewed this manual of guidelines, have cut out volumes of procedural and process instructions, and cut the A to Z distance between a staff member wanting to do something and a decision being taken and enacted to an extent that we estimate that we are now able to save 33 full working days per year per programming staff, simply in terms of having reviewed the operations system of UNDP. And this, Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen, is just the beginning. And I am therefore extremely optimistic that when I say to you, we are reviewing our business model and processes, this is not tinkering at the edges. We are going to the center of the organization's engine room and building out from there a business model that will hopefully one day generate in your observations terms like efficient, effective, agile, responsive. These are the yardsticks that I have given to our managers in looking for both innovation and casting and shedding the kind of overload that we have been carrying with us. At the same time, we have commissioned a review of our policy function, which my colleague Mar, together with our directors in the management team, is now leading. It goes to the core of asking what is the value of UNDP as a global platform that connects best practices and innovation across 170 countries, and what is going wrong if our country teams are the first ones to say that we don't get the support from the global infrastructure that we need. So we're going to turn the model completely upside down and view the UNDP offering as a global network of policy and advisory experts, in a sense SDG experts, deployed across the full spectrum of UNDP's work, and use the global infrastructure to create the kind of connectivity that allows us to manage a modern institution that is able to access and tap cutting-edge knowledge and provide it to where it is needed in an instant, as opposed to in a kind of search and find process that we operate in now. These are just two illustrations of the kind of work that is underway and where we have used the 6 months since you authorized us to proceed with the strategic plan to great effect. And when I say to you we're an organization on the move, both of these processes will come to completion by the month of July, and from there on will drive a new implementation framework for the organization. We have also focused very much on understanding this notion of innovation being our business. I now convene once a month an innovation call with staff where we profile 2 programs from around the world that present what they consider to be a groundbreaking innovation in their work. We invite other teams to join, and you would be surprised at the level of interest. On average, we have 900 callers connecting to these innovation calls across our team. And I want to pay tribute here to somebody who was critical in providing us with this idea, my colleague Dr. Hiro from Japan, who leads a team in Japan working on SDGs and business, and basically has been an advisor to us to try and see how do you actually lead in an organization in fostering innovation when you have a sea of experimentation, but often amongst the staff, very little confidence that the leadership is actually willing to back it up, including the risk of innovation. And here, Excellencies, let me please appeal to you. Part of my life as the Chief Executive of UNDP is to manage the situation when things go wrong. And sometimes they go wrong because people either have committed a crime or simply an act of stupidity. But more often than not, what actually people are doing is they're experimenting, they're innovating. And I also seek your indulgence and understanding that when you see something go wrong, please let your first instinct be, is this maybe something that was genuinely intelligent and right to do, and therefore it is not a failure, it is part of the process of development partnership, or is it something that should not have happened? Because more often than not, we scare our own staff into actually taking risks and leading by finding new spaces. To support this work, I have also established a country investment facility. Basically, we have made available $20 million that are essentially now being deployed to UNDP country offices on the basis of innovative approaches that they have developed with their partners in country, and is driving a far broader portfolio of innovation for UNDP and connecting it to our global work that I referred to earlier on. I have launched also a new small but vital project catalyst, which is in essence having a small team and a large number of external partners helping us to look at tomorrow's world in how it will shape development choices today, where countries are looking to UNDP and we ourselves are sometimes behind the curve. I hope within 6 months to share with you some of the interesting outcomes that will emerge from that, alongside the development of our new private sector strategy, including the sort of engagements that I mentioned to some of you already and in the town hall, where we are now joining up with the World Bank and leading insurance companies around the world in the Insurance Development Forum. And together with the CEOs of these companies are looking at how can we address a phenomenon where 40%, you have heard me mention this number before, of people who escape poverty fall back into it, and very often because of the vulnerability of no health insurance and essentially illnesses in their family. We are now focused on trying to, with the Insurance Development Forum, look at how governments can adjust their public policy framework to allow markets for micro-health insurance solutions to emerge, which would significantly reduce the risk of those who have managed to get out of poverty from immediately falling back into it when their father or their mother falls ill. These are the kinds of solutions that are not about getting a few $1 million from a company channeled through UNDP. This is about changing the way that both governance can influence markets and the private sector can develop markets that are in alignment with SDG outcomes. Alongside that, we are also working very much on the broader financial issue. Another project that I have launched, Project T, is asking the question, together also with the experience of the UNCDF, of what is the role and future of UNDP alongside governments to help expand the scope for private capital, private investments at the national level in domestic financial markets to support the implementation of SDGs. These are true frontier areas, and much to my surprise, many of our teams at the country level have already been experimenting, but the organization has not kept pace with that. And this includes our dialogue also with the Islamic Development Bank, where we are now implementing a partnership on global Islamic finance impact investment, including the establishment of a new platform, alongside our growing IFI partnerships with the World Bank and others, where, for instance, in leveraging finance for climate change, we are literally tied by the hip in working in support of the Paris Agreement. This all fits very well also with our commitment to South-South collaboration. As you have heard me say before, we not only have the privilege of hosting the office of South-South cooperation, we also, in our work, consider South-South cooperation to be integral to the work we do today. More often than not, our experts today come from the Global South as much as from the Global North, and the policy solutions that we both bring and transport across the world have their source in innovations in the Global South. And therefore, the lead-up to the Buenos Aires Plan of Action and PABA Plus 40 conference next year in March in Argentina will be a good moment to take stock of what is the next chapter, what is the next generation of South-South cooperation in a global context of development going to look like. We are very pleased to work together with the office of South-South cooperation with Argentina, and all of you in preparing this meeting. Let me now come to my final point, which is locating all that which I have described against the backdrop of UN reform. You have taken a bold bet on the future. Together with the Secretary General, you adopted last week a far-reaching reform of the UN development system. As we already foreshadowed in our strategic plan, it was designed to be reform-ready, and therefore I want to confirm to you that we in UNDP are indeed ready to play our part, and it is an essential part in this UN development system reform process. It is, in the first instance, a challenge of transition. After decades of hosting a resident coordinator function of all the systems, managerial, infrastructure, personnel, accountability, accounts, and I could go on, being provided by UNDP to the resident coordinator system, all this now has to be lifted and shifted. It has to transition. And therefore, a significant challenge and commitment on my part and that of UNDP is to do the utmost we can to ensure a rapid and smooth transition in terms of the resident coordinator system by the 1st of January, Dokgo, and all the bits and pieces, if I may use that term for a moment, that go with this lift and shift. And Excellencies, as we have discovered, and I have shared also with the DSG in a 5-page memo, the bits and pieces are not just a small tail. They are a long tail of things that we have to get right. But the other commitment from UNDP is also to, in this new configuration, play the role that you have in the resolution and the Secretary General in his articulation of the focus of UNDP's support to this new system, that which we have to deliver in the future. We will commit to ensuring that the resident coordinator's office is supported, whether in a back office sense through the service level agreement that we will negotiate with the Secretariat, in substantive terms through our resident representative and his or her team at the country level in providing the substantive support that is needed for that coordination function, and equally to develop, mature that integrator platform that is second nature to UNDP, and that I often say is now really an integrator platform 2.0, because it is not a new phenomenon. UNDP, by nature and by virtue of its mandate, has often been a platform on which multiple aspects of a development policy or program come together. I think in the excellence of the service we provide, we will become in future the kind of magnet for joint implementation, and therefore an asset to the objectives of the UN development system. Let me, however, also say that you and we know that in the decision that you have taken and in the outcome of this resolution, you have set yourselves and ourselves an enormous challenge, the financing of this new system. And therefore I want to just echo the discussions that you have had amongst yourselves as member states that are also certainly foremost on our minds right now. First of all, to ensure a timely resourcing of the new structure so that a smooth transition can happen, because the 1st of January is not very far away. And secondly, to please bear in mind that in lifting and shifting the system, you are creating a new system, a freestanding system, an independent system, a system that is delinked from UNDP, but UNDP will continue to have to maintain its leadership at the country level, its resident representative. For the last 30 years, you bought 2 for 1. We cannot simply assume that in lifting and shifting, suddenly UNDP should drop a significant layer of its capacity at country level. So please look carefully as you take your decisions in moving forward, because if the default consequence of a new, empowered, independent, full-time resident coordinator system essentially results in defunding UNDP's work, I think the price is one that none of us would like to pay. And I simply alert you to this because it is over the next 6 to 12 months that your decisions will be central to this. Mr. President, let me end by just briefly speaking also to my role in being the administrator of UNDP in the context of the duty of care. Whether it is in these transitions now that affect literally hundreds of staff, I take my responsibility very seriously to ensure that staff are not simply pawns that are moved on a board. We must engage with our staff. We must make sure that the transition, whether it is a resident coordinator, whether it is the staff of Dokgo, happens in a way that is both transparent, effective, and fair. And therefore, we will need to ensure, together with the Staff Council, with the Secretary General, the DSG, and many others in the Secretariat, that we manage these transitions well. But my duty of care also extends to the broader domain of the working conditions in UNDP as an organization. And I'm very conscious of the importance of actually addressing these priorities. And here, I want to simply mention two that I know will be of significant interest to many of you. They have to do both with the policy for protection against retaliation, our enhanced annual financial disclosure program, and the extended mandatory online ethics trainings that we have now made part of UNDP. It relates also to the issue of gender parity in the organization. UNDP is today an organization with more than 50% of staff being women, but as you know, we still face some challenges at senior levels, for instance at the D1 levels and above, where women occupy 39% of the positions right now. I hope that over the next few days, the Secretary General will announce the next appointments in terms of senior leadership in UNDP, and that will go some way towards addressing this, but it is still an issue on which we must work. And therefore, the new gender parity strategy that we have developed and adopted for the period of this plan provides a very clear roadmap of how we intend to achieve that. I also cannot speak to the duty of care issue without mentioning the issue of harassment, sexual harassment, discrimination, and abuse of authority policies in our organization. We were proud to be part of the briefing on Monday, therefore I will not go into the details, but I just want to reiterate that this is a topic that is painful to, first of all, the victims, painful to an organization that has uncomfortably seen it go on around itself and within itself for a long time, and either did not feel empowered or did not feel courageous enough or did not feel it was worthwhile challenging. And therefore, I simply want to reiterate, not simply with the notion of zero tolerance. We know that we have zero tolerance, but zero tolerance is not a guarantee for zero incidents. And even the notion of hopefully getting one day to a zero incident is nothing we can ever guarantee. But in everything we have done in providing both a review and a new set of policies and practices that we developed together with the staff, I feel, in terms of the feedback received, that we have come a significant way from where we have actually been able to address these issues. Finally, let me also, in terms of duty of care to the organization, just make reference briefly to something that I take extremely seriously. Evaluations, the function of the Office of Evaluation, independent audits, the Joint Inspection Unit, and also the recommendations that we have received from our auditors from the Joint Inspection Unit are central to the way that I believe I can better, together with my senior team, manage this organization. I want to express my appreciation and gratitude to the evaluation officers, the auditors, the Joint Inspection Unit, and others who have been part of changing the way we look at our work in terms of success and failure, and therefore acknowledge the importance both to us in management, but hopefully also to you, of these functions. In your board meeting this week, you will also have the pleasure of adopting a number of new country programs for Kenya, Malawi, and Rwanda. I mention this as my last point because what I meant to emphasize is that in all the changes and reforms and challenges that we currently are trying to address, the work continues. UNDP is an organization on the move. It measures its impact by the way that we can continue to assure that that which we want to do at the country level continues while we reinvent, refocus, and realign the organization with both internal and external changes around us. And to those of you who sometimes wonder, is such a large organization an asset to you as member states and to the UN development system, let me just share 3 statistics with you that speak to the scale. Over the last year, our energy projects helped more than 6.7 million people living with improved access to energy. More than 2 million individuals across the world, HIV patients, were able to receive ARV treatments and are therefore more likely to be alive today than having passed away. These are figures in the millions. And in 2017, we also created work to improve the lives of over 37.5 million people. I mention these to you because we may not be the most agile, small startup operation. We are nothing like an NGO either. But excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in having established a United Nations Development Programme as member states, as an integral part of the multilateral platform with which we assist countries in their development path, you have created an extraordinary resource, where if you contribute 1 million, you are leveraging roughly 4.9 billion of other countries' resources in order to deliver services on issues that I pointed out at the beginning are simply not addressable individually in isolation. And certainly, as a global community, with the SDGs now as our framework, we are bound to work together and we are bound to succeed because we invest in one another. And I hope that UNDP is one of the expressions of this core idea in the United Nations system. Thank you very much.